We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Today, I'm really happy to be joined once again by Inez Stepman, Senior Policy Analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. Inez, thank you so much for taking the time to talk today on the eve of Joe Biden's inauguration.
Thank you so much for having me back on here, Emily. It's always an enlightening conversation for me to hear what you have to say as well. I think we don't have too much that's upbeat to say today, but let's see if we can't find something positive to pull out of this.
Well, I was going to say the last time Inez and I spoke, she was very optimistic about the future. I would say suspiciously optimistic about the future. But that's probably waned a bit in the aftermath of what we've seen in the last couple of weeks. I want to begin actually by reading Inez a quote from Donald Trump's farewell address, which was, we're talking here literally on the eve of inauguration, so Tuesday evening. Here's a quote from that address. I go from this majestic place with a loyal and joyful heart and optimistic spirit, and a supreme confidence that for our country and for our children, the best is yet to come. Thank you and farewell. So Trump is obviously an imperfect vessel for the conservative movement, and he's had advantages and disadvantages in his own way. Advantages include we would never have talked about a lot of the sort of cultural battles that have always been more important than the battles over NAFTA, politically and principally, without Donald Trump sort of forcing the issue. Of course, there are disadvantages from a moral perspective, that are you can list those off sort of left and right, and they're tired and cliched in some cases, and important in others. But does that sort of quote evoke in you a sense that perhaps he was this imperfect vessel for that last gasp of a country in decline? And that sounds enormously pessimistic, but 2 weeks after what we saw at the Capitol, it's kind of what it feels like.
Yeah, I was just thinking that as you were saying that Donald Trump's absolute best and highest moments over the last 4 years, especially with regard to his speeches, have all been in recalling the American past, right? Think about his State of the Union address, where he called on American heroes from 1776 all the way to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and rattled them off. Think about the 1776 commission that was released yesterday that recalls what was important about 1776, lists some of the attacks and puts out historical rejoinder to some of the attacks on 1776. His Donald Trump's speech in Warsaw, right, where he called upon people to be proud of being part of the West, of Western civilization. I mean, his greatest moments really have been in recalling the greatness of America and the greatness of the West. Unfortunately, you know, that's exactly why I think we're embroiled in such a deep culture war. At the end of the day, we have a smaller and smaller percentage of our population that believes that America was ever great. And we can get into the horrible events of January 6th, and I'm sure all kinds of things about institutional faith in some common body of media as a fact checker. That's all completely collapsed. But I've always believed fundamentally that anybody who thinks that Donald Trump is actually the instigator of a lot of these negative trends in our society is not thinking hard enough about what where those trends started, and the fact that they were definitely long in place before Donald Trump ever came down the escalator. I've always seen him much more as the symptom than the cause, and that includes in the most recent violence, right? I don't think Donald Trump is the cause or the incitement, or I don't believe he incited violence on January 6th. Although he certainly has never done much to calm things down, he's not a unifier, right? But I do think that even there, I see him as so much that more of a symptom than the cause of our problems. And I'm actually the reason that I think I am quite I'm quite afraid of where we go from here is exactly because we refuse almost categorically to do the kind of difficult institution and faith building work. Here, I'm not talking about religious faith, obviously, but although that could be a part of it, but faith in some kind of common history, some kind of common institutions, a common body of understanding about reality that we don't seem to have, and the rebuilding of which is extremely difficult, but nobody seems to have the stomach for that right now. Um, and that's why I find myself quite cynical and not seeing how we're going to pull out of this death spiral, which is particularly depressing, I have to say, to me as somebody who was born in this country by just a few weeks, whose parents did flee authoritarianism, fled communism, tried to become Americans and to provide a place for me that where I would be free and where some of those ideals of 1776 would continue to exist. And um, I'm not saying it's all over for us. I'm sure there have been plenty of points in our history where things have looked very bleak, but this is definitely a bleak point in our history, and things do need to change.
Yeah, the pessimism from somebody who's married to a historian is not is not making me more optimistic about anything.
Yeah. No, it doesn't make me optimistic because my husband, Jarrett Stepman, he's the optimistic American of the relationship. Usually, I'm the cynical,
Slav.
Slavic soul or whatever, and he's
Yeah.
he's the optimistic guy, and he has great faith in the American people. And I think even after the election, I had great faith in the American people, and to some extent, I still do. I do think that Americans are more practical than many other people of the world. They're more pragmatic, and there still are millions and millions of Americans out there who are not. They're not at their boiling point, right? Not everybody in this country is at their boiling point, and there's still millions of people out there who do are doing the hard work of real democracy, right? Which is was building ties with their neighbors and taking care of their families and building the kind of civic society that's necessary to support freedom and self government, right? But it seems like our institutions are no longer engaged in that project, and there are real consequences to that, right? I mean, we've been talking about that for years and years, the collapse of faith in all institutions, right? Whether that's media, whether it's the academy and universities that have lost the support, the majority support of the American people over the past 4 or 5 years. Whether it's Hollywood or cultural, and then finally whether it's our major corporations, our large American companies, or I should say now transnational companies. Um, all of those institutions, like, they actually matter, and in critiquing them, the right has, I think, sometimes forgotten what things are like when we don't have any of those common institutions. And I think we're seeing it with regard to the pandemic, for example, where the CDC has absolutely no credibility, but they have squandered it themselves, right? The moment we lost control of this pandemic, the moment that health officials came out and said it's okay to gather as long as you're protesting for the correct political cause. Like, that's the moment that we lost control of this. And it frustrates me that people always see the reaction and they never go back and look for the cause.
Yeah, you raised a crucial chicken question, and it's a question that our elite class has spent the last 4 years coming up with the wrong answers to, and that's especially disappointing and disheartening because I think if the I say this all the time, and if you're a regular listener to the podcast, you've heard me say this before, and it's probably getting old, but if the host of Celebrity Apprentice defeating the former Secretary of State and First Lady in the presidential election wasn't a wake up call for the corporate media and for the political class, I don't know that there possibly can be a wake up call. The Capitol riot certainly wasn't a wake up call, but either. I mean, in both cases, we've seen the corporate press embracing the wrong instincts in their sort of reflections about why things are happening. And that's really the point that you're raising. It's this chicken or egg question, right? Like, are Americans right to distrust? Do Americans distrust the CDC and our scientific institutions and our corporate media for legitimate reasons? Do they distrust our financial institutions that in so many cases left them desolate? Do they, because of what happened during the recession, do they distrust them for legitimate reasons? And the political class, time and again, says the answer to that is no. Right? Like there are responsible actors here at our financial institutions. Look at Jamie Dimon, look at Howard Schultz, look at Anthony Fauci, look at all of these people. Only rubes distrust them. And the corporate press, this is like totally the coming apart Charles Murray phenomenon, has had such different experiences than so many people in this country. So many people in this country have very reasonable justifications for distrusting some of our most key institutions. And I actually want to read one of your tweets, Inez, because I think it gets at this. Inez tweeted today, hot take, if not just a handful of kooks, but millions upon millions of Americans think that Alex Jones and Q are more trustworthy than CNN at all. It might be worth thinking about what role CNN played in making that happen. Now, this is indeed, as Inez characterized it, a hot take. And I'm going to share a personal experience I rarely ever discuss right now, which is that couple of years ago, after that horrible pipe bomber sent mail to CNN and the headquarters of other corporate outlets, I went on Media Buzz and was having a conversation about it and was asked more generally about distrust in media, and said very clearly that this is the fault, the pipe bombs are squarely the fault of the man who sent them and devised this horrific plan. I have friends who work at CNN, as I'm sure you do, Inez, and it's terrible. It's a scary thing. But that said, the general broader distrust in media, CNN has done literally nothing to address why people distrust it. Why people at Trump rallies? Why are there people at Trump rallies chanting CNN sucks? Now, I'm not saying again that the pipe bomb was anybody's fault, but the man who sent it, CNN, bears no responsibility for that. There's no way whatsoever. But I got absolutely misquoted, taken out of context everywhere, written up, basically because people were framing it as me saying CNN deserved to get pipe bombs in the mail. And this is just another great example. I mean, it just proves the point that none of these outlets, it's just an ironic sort of case in point, right? That none of these outlets are, responsible actors, and people distrust them for a very, very, very good reason. And I think that's sort of the perfect illustration of your tweet. And I'm sure you got some similar responses that I did from this tweet, but can you talk a little bit more, expound on that point? This is not you saying people should trust Alex Jones, although I'm sure some people interpret it that way. Tell us a little bit more about what you meant by that.
Yeah, obviously, I wasn't saying the people should trust Alex Jones and Q. Personally, I've never actually listened to an entire Alex Jones show, only clips and gifs on the internet. No, I think I'm making exactly a similar point. I think you made the point really well in your piece, the week of the Capitol attacks, which is to say that we have to confront the fact that mistrust in media and in a bunch of our institutions is reasonable. That doesn't mean that the actions then either, of course, the violent actions, right, and the actual murder of a police officer is those people are responsible for their violent acts, but we cannot move forward out of this unless we understand why, because it's not just a handful of lunatics, right, who attack the Capitol, and they are lunatics, right? But it's millions and millions and millions of Americans who are find themselves thinking that Alex Jones sounds more reasonable than CNN, um, and we can't ignore the fact that it is in some way not reasonable to think that Alex Jones makes sense. I think that step is wrong, but we can't understand why so many people have taken that wrong turn unless we understand why it was reasonable for them to mistrust the media to begin with. It was reasonable for them to mistrust their institutions, just like it is reasonable for people to mistrust the CDC after they change a lot of their directions, right? And without acknowledging, right? And then later come out and say, oh, we did it because we couldn't trust you with the truth. And it is reasonable to mistrust the CDC or health experts when they break all of their own advice for their favored political causes. And I say this as somebody who takes this pandemic extremely seriously. Um, and I do take all of the precautions that are recommended and so on and so forth, because I think even a broken clock can be right twice a day, right? I did my own investigation of the facts of the matter, and frankly, actually, while we're telling personal stories, I find it striking that with regard to the pandemic, the only person that I essentially take advice from on COVID is a long-term friend of mine from college, who's an emergency room doctor,
Mhm.
because I have that personal trust in him, that he doesn't have a political agenda. He's giving me straight up medical advice, and I found it as somebody who works, as a writer, who works as a policy analyst, who's sort of lives and breathes politics all day. I found it difficult to find unbiased, information about the pandemic that wasn't trying to feed one narrative or the other. I found that difficult, and I spend a ton of time doing exactly that. And now we're going to say that it's completely unreasonable that somebody, who doesn't spend, all this time digging through various media sources and reading legislation, right, all day long, finds it difficult to know who to trust. I find it difficult to know who to trust. I
Yeah.
It's reasonable. It's a reasonable reaction to the collapse of any kind of standards on the part of gatekeepers in a whole bunch of institutions, and they kept drawing down on that institutional credit that used to be extremely high in this country. We actually had very high social trust in certain measures, right? In decades and decades ago, in the good old days, right? So,
Yeah, right.
I say that tongue in cheek, as in I know that uh, that there's a tendency to nostalgia on the right, that isn't always accurate.
Granted, I still don't think women should be educated
That's fair. That's
or
fair.
work outside the home.
Or vote, really. No,
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 that's right.
no. But so jokes aside, though, like, I know that there were no, sort of quote good old days, but I think it's undeniable that in the last several decades we've seen trust in those institutions plummet. Um, as a result of their own actions, and they kept drawing down on that institutional trust. And the fallacy in that thinking is that, if you use that kind of platform and position and trust that people have put in you for a political agenda repeatedly, and even put out false information to do so, which every major mainstream outlet has put out actively false stories about Donald Trump, pretty much. And I'm sure that you can rattle off the examples better than I can. But it is a complete mistake to think that you can continually draw on that public trust and credit that was once bipartisan while using it for your own ideological and partisan ends forever.
Yeah.
Eventually, the bank account hits empty. You overdraft, and that's what's happening now. And it's a really bad thing. I don't want to downplay how bad a situation that is when you don't have any common institutions, when you don't have trust, in any kind of sort of place to go for information that can convince both a Donald Trump supporter and a Biden supporter, and a Bernie supporter, or and a whoever supporter. If you have no common institutions or sort of uh, people that you trust to at least be factual, regardless of which political side of the aisle and what their opinions are, that's a really bad thing, and it ends up exactly with what we're seeing now, with people who are taking advantage of the fact that people don't trust the mainstream gatekeepers to feed other kinds of false information to people, right? So it's not that I think this is, or I'm blasé about this result, but we have been warning for a very long time that this is going to happen. I think Emily's gone. Technical problems, or we said something that big tech doesn't like. No, I'm kidding. I can hear your voice. You're back.
Okay, we should be good with my audio now. Let's see. So to that point, Inez, what I want to ask you is, I saw when I was at the Trump rally that turned into a riot, I was talking to folks, and the one thing that they said over and over again was that the only person that they trust is Donald Trump. And they said they'll follow him to a third party. You know, they would offer that up, and that, you know, they were upset with various, you know, news channels, whatever it was. But I can't, you know, it's hard for me to actually blame anyone. And this is something that would sound so icky to the Beltway, but it's genuinely hard for me to blame a single person for only trusting Donald Trump, because who else are they supposed to trust? Are they supposed to trust the New York Times? Are they supposed to trust CNN? Are they supposed to trust the Washington Post? Every single one of those institutions has
Or
failed.
establishment Republicans.
Yeah,
frankly.
exactly. No, exactly. That's 100% true. And so what is the solutions? What is the solution going forward to that particular issue?
Look, it's never good to place any trust in politicians ever. But I do think that a lot of these folks' understanding of Donald Trump is slightly more sophisticated than the Beltway denizens think it is. That is to say, that most people, even some of the most fervent Donald Trump supporters, understands that the president lies. Right? They understand that he lies about, you know, the size of his crowds or his, you know, all kinds of things. Right? They understand that he does tell lies as a politician, but they trusted him on the big stuff. They trusted that that what that like at this point it's almost played out, right? But they took him seriously, but not literally. They didn't believe every sort of hyperbolic Queen's style exaggeration that the media took literally. But they did trust him on the big stuff. And the problem is that the president lied about something very big, right? And I guess lying might even be too strong, because I always get the sense that Donald Trump believes his own mystique very strongly, but that's you know, that's a personal speculation. I don't know whether the president knows or not. But this was a big thing to mislead people about, right? About whether or not the amount of fraud that has been uncovered was enough to overturn Joe Biden's margin of victory, and it seems pretty clear that it was not. Um, but there's an old clip of Bill Barr circulating the internet today that I thought was really important to watch. And it's with Wolf Blitzer, and Wolf Blitzer is sort of pressing him on, well, there's no evidence of widespread fraud. This is before the election. And Bill Barr says, look, we are setting up a system right now for this 2020 election with mass mail out ballots that everybody prior to this current moment, and he points to a commission headed by Jimmy Carter, recognizes is open to fraud. And he doesn't say there is going to be a bunch of fraud in this election. He says people aren't going to be able to trust the outcome if it's a close election. Heated and an intense ideological election. People are deeply divided on where they think the country needs to go, and both sides think the other side is going to take the country off the cliff. Like I'm paraphrasing now from what Bill Barr said, but you know, we cannot afford to have doubts about this election, is how I would rephrase what he said. And I think that's really true. And again, once again, you know, we're pretending like this election came out of nowhere, and people's mistrust and willingness to follow Donald Trump when he says the election was stolen from me comes out of nowhere. It doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from, one, not being able to trust, you know, the New York Times and the Washington Post, which is, you know, what you said, right? So not being able to trust the media to fact check anyone.
Or academia, by the way.
Or academia, or the schools, or frankly, anyone engaged, or corporate America, anyone engaged with this sort of left-wing narrative. And then similar, like on top of that, right? We have this pandemic. We have to adjust all of the rules in the last minute. We had the first mass mail out election in our history. And I mean, even personally, so my husband got dunked on by the governor of California for saying that he hadn't been a resident of California and had notified the state many times that fact, but was still receiving ballots, and that he would probably receive a ballot for the 2020 election. And the governor, dunked on him and said, "This is fake news." And sure enough, a few weeks later, that ballot showed up at his parents' house, right? He hasn't lived there in over a decade. The state of California has been notified that fact. Every friend I had in California has gotten, pretty much every friend, honestly, like it's a shocking percentage, has gotten ballots for other people who previously lived at their addresses. You put all of that and that system into the general mistrust of our society right now in an incredibly intense election, and you're trying to convince people that everything was like totally fine. And that's the funny thing. It's always, there was zero fraud in this election. Obviously there was some fraud. There has been some fraud in every election, and there was probably more in this one because it was a mass mail-in ballot, a mail-out ballot election that was much easier to commit fraud during. Now, again, I said, just 3 minutes ago, for people who are going to want to clip it out, it does not seem that there was any evidence that there was enough fraud to change the outcome of the election. And if there were, then it was Donald Trump's team's responsibility to bring that evidence to the courts. And frankly, they failed. They did not have the goods in the courts. I read some of the most important of these cases myself because, again, I didn't know who to trust on them. They brought speculation, and they did not bring any kind of actual evidence. And you cannot overturn an election on speculation. So I can say all of those things, and like you, Emily, still understand why in this environment where nobody has any trust in any of the institutions that would normally, we would turn to in this kind of contested election disagreement, nobody has any trust in any of those institutions. And Donald Trump told them that they actually won. Yeah. And I understand why people believe that. It is, to your point, it is reasonable. It is reasonable for them to trust Donald Trump over the New York Times. But that's not a good situation. We don't want to be in the position of being reliant as a country on trusting, a politician or the president instead of the institutions in this country that are meant to check the power of the president.
But the key point, and this gets to, part of the problem with our political discourse is that it's wrapped up in the daily fray, but and it's kind of divorced from the 30,000 foot perspective of time, which is also why we lose track of things like that aren't politicized, like obesity, and the way that that's changed our everyday lives, the way that technology has changed our everyday lives, which is suddenly creeping into the political discourse more than it was in the past, but it should have always been really front and center because it's what impacts our daily lives immediately and aggressively and conspicuously. But all that is to say, part of the problem with our political discourse is that it doesn't account for some stuff kind of like that. And I'm wondering, I have a hard time understanding. This is kind of like what Donald Trump as. People are saying my mic is cutting out. This is part of the problem with all of the people that are prognosticating and saying they know exactly what the Trump era is going to result in, and it's going to result in all of these shattered norms, and it's going to result in the destruction of the country, blah, 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 blah. I think personally, there was always a reasonable argument to be made that Donald Trump was shattering norms in a way that would be harmful to the country. I don't know that that's true. And I think part of our political discourse is that everybody is in the business of making predictions and immediately predicted that, of course, based on X, Y, and Z, it's all over. The country's over. The republic has ended. X, Y, and Z, blah, blah, blah. Because it's their job to make predictions and because they want to sound authoritative and declarative and dramatic. But, when we're thinking about all of this, here's a question. Is Donald Trump's, he's exiting his presidency, I think, on a really sour and unfortunate and tragic note. How do you think the conservative movement handled Donald Trump? And in the context of that preface to this question, I mean that because I mean that in the sense that, that I think there was always a reasonable argument to be made about norms, but it was a possibility, and then there were also possibilities that we had to weigh against that. So in that context, how do you think the conservative movement handled Donald Trump?
So I think I would preface my answer to that by saying that the norms that you're talking about, largely, although not entirely, and there are important counterexamples to this, but largely, I think people have confused liberal democracy with the norms of the last 30 or so years of politics. In other words, they confuse their own ideas about policy and how the country should be run. And by those ideas, I mean essentially some of the ideas that were held in bipartisan agreement between the technocratic wings of both parties, not limited to, but ideas about trade, immigration, right? About sort of friendly Washington norms and cutting deals in the Monocle restaurant, right? I think they mistook a lot of what they were used to and the power that they had for the last 30 years as liberal democracy. And so when Donald Trump challenged some of those things, I think a really good example of this was NATO, right? Like NATO is not an essential element of liberal democracy. And I say that as somebody who's like, I support, I'm in some ways pretty moderate, right? Like I do support keeping NATO as an alliance, but it is a perfectly fine thing to have a discussion about whether, a decades old alliance may have outlived its utility, right? And certainly it's legitimate to point out that the United States has carried militarily NATO for decades while many European countries refuse to meet their commitments in terms of building their own militaries. But you have a group of people in Washington who confused Donald Trump challenging NATO for Donald Trump being and the only reason he could possibly disagree with their conventional wisdom about the utility of NATO was because he was a puppet for Vladimir Putin. Okay, like that's the ridiculous place that they went instead of being open to the critique. And then to tie this back to your question, I think that the Republican Party not only responded very badly to Donald Trump, but I think maybe would have more sympathy for why they would respond badly to Donald Trump, starting with the fact that nobody likes having their own inadequacies pointed out to them, right? And their own policy inadequacies. But I have much less sympathy for how they responded to Trump's voters, right? Who make up the base of their party. It is one thing to disagree with a politician, even a politician who's the head of your party. It is another thing to have utter contempt for millions and millions of people who voted for you. And I think that a huge part of Donald Trump's appeal was rooted in that contempt. And again, we have an example of a set of gatekeepers, right, in the Republican Party, refusing to examine their own role in creating the whirlwind that brought Donald Trump to power, right? Because I would argue that it was a direct consequence of the contempt with which they treated the Tea Party. The Tea Party was the gentleman's revolt from the base. Okay, it was mostly middle-class people, middle, even upper-class people, business owners, right? Even the New York Times had to admit in their survey that actually the average Tea Party protester was better educated, particularly on American civics, than the average American, right? And not only did the media smear the Tea Party as potentially violent, which they were not. Especially given what we've seen from BLM and now from the Stop the Steal rally. The Tea Party was not violent. It was it had some really important points to make about people misunderstand when they say it was about the national debt. It was only one piece of the Tea Party. It had some really important points to make about how we are slipping away from something essential about being American. And they were very focused on a constitutional revival, right? Um, and
But
how
were
the
they? This is an
party.
important question. This is an important question. Ultimately, was the Tea Party focused on a constitutional revival? I don't think we have a clear answer to this yet because, when Trump sort of rose to power, a lot of people were saying, listen, the Tea Party was never about limited government. The Tea Party was about these sort of like cultural grievances. The left would call them racism and bigotry, which is absurd. But aren't Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party? I mean, people have been saying this for years. Aren't they the two sides of the same coin? And I think what people don't understand is that coin is not about NAFTA.
You cut out, so I'll answer the half that I heard.
That I was just saying that coin is not about NAFTA. It's not about trade policy. That two sides of the same coin has been about this immense cultural anxiety that we have, which is a reaction to technological changes, which is a reaction to all of these changes that have taken place to everyday life. But at the same time, I do also think the Tea Party was very different than the MAGA base. Like, I actually very much believe that.
Groups of people. They are two different groups of people in some ways, I think demographically, but there is some overlap. In the sense that I was a member of the Tea Party in several different states, and obviously there were like thousands of Tea Parties, and each one was different. No, I do think I think they saw the constitutional revival thing as a culture war issue. I don't think these two things are in opposition to each other. That's why I say it's wrong to think of the Tea Party as a purely like smaller government libertarian movement. It was a generalized pushback against decades of not only more spending, but and this I think they did share with Occupy Wall Street, the idea that being a responsible, patriotic American citizen was being punished, right? That there was something in our culture increasingly that was punishing people for following the rules and being, a patriotic American and paying their taxes and working hard and trying to. So there was absolutely this idea that the system is rigged. Now, the Tea Party said this isn't a problem of capitalism, right? This is a problem of the administrative state of expanded government, of government well beyond its constitutional bounds. But let's not forget what launched the Tea Party, right? It was the idea that people who had paid their mortgages, and sometimes at great cost, were going to bail out people who had, either bought too much house or had taken loans with really bad terms. And then on top of that, that we were going to bail out the banks that ought to have known better in terms of their risk assessment. There was this song that came out, kind of corny song that came out right in 2009, I believe, or maybe early 2010, that I heard a ton of times at the Tea Party rallies, and it was like very popular. And it's called "Shutting Detroit Down."
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember who sang it right now off the top of my head, but and the entire message of that song was they're bailing out their constituencies. This was a message of that there's essentially a ruling, a managerial class that is playing by different rules than the rest of us, and we are getting screwed.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that was very much a part of the Tea Party, and I do think they share that in common with Occupy Wall Street, but they have very different solutions to that, right? I don't think the Tea Party saw capitalism as the problem. They saw a government that was handing out favors to its preferred class as the problem.
Well, so a commenter says, by the way, that was John Rich's song, and I think that's
John Rich. That's right.
So and if you're listening to this podcast, we're live on YouTube, Facebook, and Periscope, so that's where we're getting comments from. The name of the song was Inez, what was it?
Shutting Detroit Down.
Shutting Detroit Down. Yeah, John Rich song. So in response to Will Green's question, but I think this is what we've just mentioned essentially is 3 demographics, right? This is like, we're talking about the MAGA base, which has some overlap with the Tea Party base, but not total overlap with the Tea Party base.
It's more working class than the Tea Party base.
It's
If you wanna get down to
absolutely
more demographics, it is more working class than the Tea Party base, which was essentially middle and upper middle class, educated, more often college educated than not. And one of the most interesting things I've seen a lot of data on in the last 4 years is how that demographic, one of the most sort of clear ways you can separate out winners and losers of the last 30 years of policies, both economically and culturally, is who has a college degree, right? And I just read an absolutely, like, I knew this sort of abstractly, and I've described it in different ways in my work, by saying, for example, that the percentage of students in college today who come from the lower half of the economic spectrum, where their families come from the lower half of the economic spectrum, is smaller today than it was in 1970. But this particular statistic just like put a sort of gut punched me. If you are a student whose math scores are in the top half of the spectrum, but your economic situation is from the bottom half, you are considerably less likely to graduate with a college degree than people who are in the upper half of the economic spectrum in terms of their family, but have lower half math scores, right? That is the death of the meritocracy. That is a statistic that underlines the fact that college degrees are now much more about delineating a managerial class and being a signal of being a member of that class than they are a meritocratic way of sort of getting ahead in life, which is how it's always sold to us when they want us to pay off student loans, right? And when I say class here, don't get me wrong, I'm not a materialist and I'm not a Marxist. This actually has much more to do, and it's correlated with economic situation. But ask somebody if it's about money. Ask a mechanic making $130,000 a year if he feels that he is part of this like ruling class of America, that his voice is actually heard in Washington, versus a school teacher who has a master's of education, right? But is making, let's say, $60,000 a year, which is the average salary of a teacher in the United States. Ask which one of those people has a bigger voice in the policy decisions that shape the country and the cultural decisions that shape the country. So this is not purely a matter of income, but it has an economic component to it. And I largely think that we have seen increasing waves of, as I said, the Tea Party was the gentleman's revolt, right? This system is rigged. And this was like small business owners saying that, people who are actually generally successful. And by the way, this correlated with people who voted for Ted Cruz in the primary rather than Donald Trump.
Yes, it did. Yes, right? And one of our commenters, by the way, just pointed out that Tim Carty wrote a book on this, which is Alienated America. He's been on this podcast several times to talk about that book, and that's exactly the point Inez just made.
Yes. So this is the first revolt, the canary in the coal mine, was the Tea Party, which were people who largely were successful in life, had checked that box off of the college degree, oftentimes for small business owners, but we're seeing their brothers or their friends get, addicted to opiates, drop out of the church, right? And stop going to weekly service, get divorced or never get married, have children out of wedlock, lose their jobs, be on a kind of permanent welfare, right? That was the canary in the coal mine from the people who had kind of made it out and done well under the system, looking around and saying, this is rigged. Like this is not going to work. And now I very much think the Donald Trump base is the other half of those folks, right? And so, yeah, I do think they're different demographically, but I think what ties them together is that if the Republican Party had responded to the Tea Party with anything but contempt.
But they responded to the Tea Party with Mitt Romney.
Right. Like if they had not, nominated Mitt Romney, if they had responded to the concerns of the Tea Party which again were expressed in through all the proper channels, right? They we picked up, we left every place we demonstrated pretty much cleaner than when we found it, right? The police loved us because they'd be like, "Ma'am, please stay on the sidewalk because you might get hit by a car." And we were like, "Yes, sir, officer, we will stay on the sidewalk and we will collect all of our trash when we come home. Thank you, officer, for protecting the peace." Like they loved us because we were really easy to deal with as protesters go, right? But the response to that was to suppress all of the forces within the base of the party that were pointing out that the conventional wisdom of the last 30 years that both Republicans and Democrats had adhered to was not working anymore. Right. And Donald Trump was the ungentlemanly revolt, right? Like the people who are completely fed up with being fed contempt instead of actually being listened to about problems they saw with their own two eyes in their own lives.
Yeah. And I think one of the problems about having Inez on the podcast is that both of us are on the exact same page when it comes to institutional failure. And you can sort of like, that is the lens through which you and I see just about everything. And we also see it, the important thing is sort of getting back to that chicken or the egg question. We see that in the same way, which is that the cause of this is very clearly the failure of institutions, which is why I prefer to talk about institutional failure over institutional distrust, because institutional distrust doesn't imply that there was sort of a failure that predated and precipitated the institutional distrust. It kind of leaves the onus on the people who distrust institutions. But as you say, even as people who sort of do this professionally, it's hard to trust institutions. We have the time.
Like that gif, right? No, it's the children who are wrong. Except it's the people who are wrong, right? And that has been the motto of Washington for the last 30 years. No, it's the people who are wrong. There's some idiotic explanation for why these deplorables, these knuckle draggers or whatever, right? There's some other explanation for why they refuse to sort of buy into the same solutions that we've been feeding them for 30 years and that we know are really the best way to run this country. So, either it must have been, interference from a foreign country, or it must have been that they're just bigots, right? We heard this with the Tea Party. We heard it about opposition to Obama's policies. We heard it, and we heard it with even ever more, vociferousness during Donald Trump, right? They're just a bunch of bigots, and America is just a white supremacist nation, and that's why. These are all excuses to not interact with the fact that there's been 30 years of consensus that has failed. Right. And I'm not saying it was always wrong. I am like a Reaganite, right? In essentials, I am. But one can't look around both domestically and internationally and pretend that we face the same problems as we did in 1983. The problems are different. They require different solutions. That doesn't mean we throw out all of our like most basic principles, but prudence is also something like that is part of governance. You need policies that respond to the actual problems that people are facing. And what we've seen is the refusal to do that. And I'm sure we could like go on for a long time about why that is. But I do think one piece of it that is often under discussed is the fact that policy is made by technocrats, not by democracy anymore, right? Congress
makes that's a big claim.
Yeah, well, Congress makes very little law, right? Comparatively to past eras. The vast majority of our law is made by bureaucrats and technocrats that are not elected and have no reason at all to listen to any kind of like democratic voice coming up from people in Wyoming or Ohio. And the other half of our issues are decided by the courts now. Again, they are properly placed beyond sort of democratic will, right? Once they're of course they're appointed by people who are elected, but once they sit on that bench, they are supposed to be impartial and only be applying the law, right? But unfortunately, we've seen in the last since the the 1960s, since the 1970s, we've seen a lot of application of issues that should be decided by democracy and having them moved into the courts. So the vast majority of what affects people's lives in terms of policy in America is not decided by Congress and not signed into law by the president. It's either coming out as regulations and dear colleague letters from agencies, from bureaucrats who live in Washington, D.C., and a handful of other places who have no incentive to be responsive to any kind of democratic will, or it's coming from the courts that are properly irresponsive, right, to democratic will, but are abusing that position to insert themselves into various culture war issues that are very clearly the province of democracy and
Right.
not of the courts. So I do think like there is like this larger picture, and but I think that's much more of a to label myself, right? That's much more like a Tea Party explanation than it is an Occupy Wall Street explanation or a MAGA explanation, right? But all of
Yeah.
these things I think are attacking the same problem, which is there is a disconnect between the people who decide how things go in the country, and here I'm not limiting myself to government, right? Not just government, but the folks who run our largest corporations, the kind of brand names that Americans interact with every single day, people who run our culture producing institutions, not just the academy and K-12 education,
Well,
but
yeah.
also Hollywood, as you've written about, right? It's just it's endless. And there this cannot keep going. Donald Trump, what I am afraid of is that we will look back after another couple years and say, oh man, like Donald Trump was a pussycat, right?
Yeah, no, that's what I wanted to, and I think that I'm glad that we built up to that, because I think we started the conversation in that same spot, which is how are we, is Trump the sort of imperfect vessel for that last gasp of a great republic? And I'm not going to be an idiot and make a prediction on that, but I'm saying that in this moment, I think it's reasonable to feel that way. And it does seem as though as we hurtle forward, you have somebody who seems anodyne and innocuous, like Joe Biden, poised to advance a lot of really radical ideas and to oversee these institutions that have been radicalized against a lot of people and are not well positioned to address the problems of a lot of people, and show absolutely no desire to become well positioned. It's not even as though some of these institutions don't understand that they need to be better about serving working people and serving people in various stations in life. It's that they don't care because they've dismissed that group of people as bigots. And so when you're at a point like that, it's so difficult to imagine, as exhausting for journalists as the Trump era has felt, and probably a lot of political observers. It's very difficult to imagine, honestly, things getting better, right? Like, is it not? I mean, and this is again where we began this entire conversation. And I'll sort of draw things to a close here by asking a final question, which is that, or at least a final sort of a final spark for discussion, which is, I asked earlier how the conservative movement handled Donald Trump, and that to me is an incredibly interesting question, because I don't think you'll find a lot of people that would deny Donald Trump as sort of like a regular liar, a regular exaggerator, and sort of has had a morally imperfect personal life. I don't think you'll find a lot of people in conservative circles who'll disagree with that. But a lot of people in conservative circles do not, and made the decision not to sort of be hysterical about those breaches of Washington decency on a daily basis, right? Like, this wasn't worth, the kind of couch fainting that so many people did day in and day out. Not our institutions, but our system is ultimately strong. It will survive. Our courts are fine. X, Y, Z, go down the list. Do you think? And the Capitol rally that turned into a riot, lots of thousands and thousands of peaceful people gathered for the president's speech. I was there, and a smaller group, but still an unacceptably large group, turned that into a riot. And I think unacceptable is one word, but also surprising is another word. It was genuinely very interesting to see the people who were kind of being whipped into a frenzy here. But this is all a long sort of build up to my question, which is that, did conservatives make the right calculation in saying, here we have Donald J. Trump, a man who is, not exactly Ronald Reagan. In some good ways, he's not exactly Mitt Romney, and then perhaps in some worse ways. Was it right for conservatives to say we're going to use this tool, and we're not going to make it impossible to work with Donald Trump. We're not going to make it impossible for us to have a working relationship with Donald Trump. Do you think that that time will prove that to be a good decision or bad decision?
Well, again, I think the larger problem is the contempt for Trump's voters,
Yeah.
right? That Republicans thought they could use Donald Trump to their own ends was always dumb calculus, uh, because they should have realized that the millions of people who brought Trump to power brought him exactly in opposition to some of the things that they hoped they could sort of manipulate out of the Trump administration. And
Mm-hmm.
I again, we can have a specific policy discussion on whether I think his ideas on trade are right or wrong, whether I think are good for the country. Um, but you cannot exist as a political party when you are like consistently contemptuous and ignore the voices of the people who vote for you.
And that, by the way, and that's not about NAFTA. To bring this point up again, it's not that they have contempt for people who are upset about TPP or who are upset about NAFTA or who are upset about the minimum wage. This is about having contempt for people who believe in the essentialism of biological sex. This is about having contempt for people who are infuriated by political correctness. This is about having contempt for people who openly distrust the corporate media, even though people in Congress have the same sort of distrust, but they're much more fearful, or they used to be much more fearful of voicing it, because they wanted to avoid the controversy. So I just think, and we're on the same page about this, but that is
It's
such
a
a key.
it is a cultural contempt for a way of life. And there is an economic dimension to this, but it is not, and this is perhaps where you and I part ways with some of our friends like Saga, or on Hill TV, or Crystal Ball on Hill TV Rising, or some other folks in the sort of realignment space. It has an economic component, but it's not purely economic. It is about a way of life overall. Now, there's an economic piece to that way of life, right? But and that's an important piece, but it is also a cultural way of life, um,
Mhm.
and that has been under assault, and people want to see someone fight back for the way that they have lived their lives,
Yeah.
and how they hope to continue to live their life. And the reason that I'm not particularly optimistic, um, is because even as we go through what seem to be ever escalating crises in gravity, right? We have a once in a century pandemic. Um, we have an attending economic collapse,
Mm.
right? And then we have the cataclysms of violence, of political violence that started over the summer with cities across America having large pieces of their downtowns on fire,
Mhm.
from BLM riots, and now riots from the other team, right? A riot in the U.S. Capitol,
Mhm.
and um, there's this strange element of all of this violence, and perhaps it has something to do with the fact that we are largely disconnected physically from each other because of this pandemic, or I could think of a lot of sort of long-term trends that also contribute to this. But the reason that I'm pessimistic is that this should be, any one of these things should have been a wake-up call that it is important to rebuild our institutions, right? As
Mhm.
you said, the first wake-up call should have been that Donald Trump got elected, right? And instead of doing a serious examination, I've almost and we've talked about this before, I think on Twitter or something, but it almost feels like everybody is sort of LARPing the revolution,
I love
There
that.
was this poll that came out today that 37% of people they asked people, do you plan to tune into the inauguration speech and everything? And a certain percentage of people said yes. The majority said yes. And then they asked, why are you tuning in? Is it to hear Biden's speech, or is it to see if there's violence?
Mhm.
And 37% of people admitted it was both, right? You had 6% who admitted they were only tuning in to see the violence. But like, what is that? It's basically, mom, turn on the TV. I want to see the revolution. Like, there's this very weird LARPy sheen to this that is amplified by the aesthetics of the whole thing, right? We've got this idiotic band of losers with horns on their heads standing behind, Nancy Pelosi's podium in the
Mhm.
House of Representatives of the United States of America. And it is this sort of disconnected response that this is just sort of more of the same, that these aren't really crises for us to face in a serious way. The left, you have pretending that 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump are going to just dissipate into thin air, um, if they're removed from Twitter. And again, this tech censorship is just another excuse to avoid confronting how the consensus of the last 30 years has failed people, right? Because if you imagine that they're just being whipped up on, Twitter by Donald Trump's tweets, right? Or you imagine that, and I'm not saying that there's a serious conversation to be had about social media and how it affects our relationships and how it affects our views and all of that stuff. But as a response to this event, I see this as absolutely another way to avoid taking responsibility. And I don't see either they're going to have to take responsibility, which I think at this point, if we haven't been shaken out of our LARPy stupor by a pandemic, cataclysms of violence for months, of political violence in the United States of America, by a guy's, rioters on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, I don't see what is going to shake us out of it, from that perspective. Or these gatekeepers and institutions simply have to be circumvented.
Mhm.
And the only sort of bit of hope I have, which is good for closing on, if Emily doesn't drag us down as she is wont to do in the last 15 seconds, um, especially with media, I do think that there is circumvention going on. Um, the podcast world, uh, the sort of independent shows, the folks that you and Ben Dominant wrote about, us, the new Contras, um, the fact that there are so many people out there who are invested in hearing that kind of discussion, which is often uh, ideologically heterodox, um,
Mhm.
from either party's perspective. The fact that there are so many people who are interested in that, um, is hopeful. I think that is one way to specifically deal with the problem of media, is to just make it so that a lot fewer people are watching CNN, MSNBC, and you and I both love Fox News. We go on there, like, and Fox News, right? Or even something like One America or Newsmax, and instead tuning into these longer form discussions with heterodox thinkers. I think that is an encouraging sign. Um, Now, of course, we'll see the response of the establishment, as it has been, and by establishment I mean everything: government, cultural, media, all of the things that corporate that we were talking about, is going to try to shut off those voices, and we've seen that already, right? We've seen the AP put out stories like, misinformation and extremism is circulating on podcasts. What do we do about this? Right?
Shut
Um,
down.
yeah, I mean that's going to be the impulse, but I do think that it's going to be really difficult to do it.
Yeah.
Because
No,
that's what people, increasingly millions of people do want that, and they're going to find a way to have access to that kind of heterodox thinking, and that is the only upside or the only bright spot, that I see as I look around, uh, around the
yeah.
country.
No, and like, listen, Inez is an expert on academia, and on that entire atmosphere, and the situation there. And that's, I mean, when you say that we need to drive people away from some of these corporate press outlets, et cetera, a huge part of that is also academia has played such a gatekeeping role of bringing people into, newsrooms, boardrooms, and the other crucial element of that I add is writers' rooms in Hollywood, which
Yes.
set our cultural agenda. But yeah, I mean, listen, to end things here, I just want to say there are a whole lot of people that adore Donald Trump as he departs from office tomorrow. There are a whole lot of people who absolutely adore Donald Trump. They trust Donald Trump, and that's a perfectly reasonable thing, because
They're
every
not
other
going away,
they're
whatever
not
you
going
think.
away.
So you
For
better find some way to live alongside those 74 million people,
Yeah,
as fellow citizens, or things are gonna get worse.
yeah, yeah, and listen, like, it's important for us to say right now that those people are not going away, and they are not, necessarily bigots for believing what they believe and for voting how they vote. That's 74 million Americans, and the political class and the media class is utterly insistent that that cannot be possible. And so there's this incredible cultural fissure that seems at this juncture almost impossible to sort of heal. And I think the bottom line is the one thing that people refuse to acknowledge that they should acknowledge is that people who trust Donald Trump above everything else are reasonable for that perspective. And
I hate to break into the last thing, but I'm not sure I actually fully agree with that statement. I think they are reasonable to mistrust everyone else.
yeah,
And I
that's
would
right.
encourage them to apply more skepticism even to somebody who they think is their champion, which is a traditional American cultural sort of folk way of hating politicians and hating all politicians.
Yes. Well, listen, I don't disagree with that at all. Not one bit. Yes, absolutely. Politicians are, but it doesn't really seem so many people be different than other politicians. And so again, like, I understand why somebody who seems to diverge from the political mold, yeah, 100%. But Inez and I clearly, I mean, I really think we could keep going for another like 3 hours. And I feel like I've said that on our podcast before, but we have to at some point have a cutoff. And so I'm arbitrarily cutting us off right now.
Well, it's always a pleasure to speak with you, Emily, even if it is longer than you anticipated, and probably gets very boring to some people. But I had a good time, so
Yeah, everybody,
that's all that matters.
shout out to everybody who hates Inez. Please leave a comment, call her out, boycott Inez, cancel Inez. I'm kidding. Don't do any of those things. And Inez is lovely, and one of the best people that you can follow in terms of her writing. She's a senior contributor at the Federalist, so you can read her work on our website. She's also a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. Fantastic group. So with that being said, Inez, thank you so much for joining Federalist Radio Hour once again on the eve of Joe Biden's inauguration.
Thanks so much for having me, Emily.
All right. Well, I'm Emily Jashinsky. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the